World War II was about as high stakes as a conflict could get, and while some generals shone on the battlefield, others very much didn't. Mark Clark is one of the most controversial American generals to have served in World War II. In Marshall and His Generals, Stephen R. Tafe touches on Clark's reputation as a glory hogger, writing, "He craved the limelight and was a shameless self-promoter, often at the expense of others. His temper, vanity, chauvinism, and aloofness toward subordinates worked against him too, so that more than one officer later called Clark his own worst enemy. This often hampered Clark's relationships with other commanders, and especially the British leaders with whom he served in Italy. In January 1944, for example, Clark ordered the crossing of the Rapido River despite the reservations of his subordinates. German resistance was heavy and the attempted crossings failed, leading to over 1,000 casualties for the 36th Division. After the war, the men of the 36th would request an official congressional investigation into Clark's leadership. Arguably, Clark's most damaging decision, though, came in June 1944 when he successfully took Rome. While this was certainly a prestigious moment for the Allies, the strategic value of taking the city at that time has since been heavily scrutinized. This is primarily because Clark's actions directly went against the orders of his British superior, General Harold Alexander. Alexander had initially wanted Clark to cut off the retreating German 10th Army, but Clark wanted the glory of capturing the Eternal City, and so he made for Rome instead. A veteran of the First World War, Brigadier General J. MacKelvie rose to prominence shortly before D-Day when he was put in command of the 90th Infantry Division. By all accounts, though, he soon proved himself unfit for such a position. After he received his promotion, MacKelvie became known for being a protocol purist obsessed with statistics at the expense of his own troops' combat readiness. A few days after the Normandy landings began, MacKelvie's failures became clear. According to James Holland's Normandy 44, the general and his division made such little progress against German opposition that his superior, General J. Lawton Collins, went to the front to investigate. Collins was shocked at the timidity displayed by the men of the 90th. When he pressed MacKelvie for an explanation, he was met with an honest lack of answers. It's since been said that the division's assistant commander, Samuel Tankersley Williams, found MacKelvie curled up in a ditch during fighting that took place soon after D-Day. He reportedly yelled, "God damn it, General, you can't leave this division hiding in that goddamn hole." At a time when German resistance was strongest, MacKelvie's indecisive leadership was the last thing the Allies needed. He saw combat for only 4 days before being relieved of command and transferred to an artillery formation. In February 1942, the Japanese military delivered a tremendous blow to the Allied Pacific War efforts when they defeated Commonwealth troops stationed in Singapore. Despite boasting a significant numerical advantage against the Japanese offensive, British forces were overwhelmed and surrendered within days.
There was no sort of any warning of that the danger was so close.
At the helm of this historic defeat was Lieutenant General Arthur Ernest Percival. As Japan continued to expand its reach in the early stages of the war, there was a widespread belief in Great Britain that Singapore was impregnable. Turns out, it wasn't. Although they had more soldiers on the ground, the British forces were not nearly as experienced as their enemy. Their tanks and aircraft weren't up to scratch either. And to be fair, Percival was well aware of this. He had demanded more resources be brought to Singapore long before the Japanese attacked. Nevertheless, his overall leadership proved to do more harm than good for the British garrison. Under Percival's leadership, bitter relationships between subordinate commanders ran rampant, leading to poor communication between the Commonwealth's multi-ethnic army. On top of that, he spread his soldiers thin across the entire Malayan Peninsula. This decision negated the British advantage of numerical superiority, allowing Japanese troops to outnumber their enemy at each individual landing zone. Worse still, Percival failed to learn from his mistakes. This exact same error was repeated when Japanese forces reached Singapore Island itself. A disastrous defeat at Singapore led to terrible Allied casualties and thousands of Commonwealth soldiers being taken as prisoners, many of whom later died in captivity. Rodolfo Graziani's name lives in infamy for the atrocities he committed against the civilians in Libya and Ethiopia as part of the Italian campaign in Africa, and yet he never appeared to show that same aggression when fighting other armies. After his campaigns in Libya and Ethiopia, Graziani battled with the British in Egypt, which is where he would suffer his greatest defeats. Having been a firm believer in mechanized warfare during his time in Ethiopia, Graziani decided to move away from this belief during his time in Egypt. His entry into the region in September 1940 was a slow one. British troops may have been forced into a much more precarious position if he had shown less caution. Instead, Graziani's approach gave his enemy a crucial head start. Operation Compass was the final nail in the coffin of Graziani's military career. A British armored offensive led by Sir Richard O'Connor struck Italian positions on December 9, 1940. Famously, Graziani's forces did little to protect a 15-mile gap in its defensive line. The Italians were quickly overwhelmed. Within days, a force of over 30,000 had been routed, with many killed or taken prisoner. Despite having boasted a significant numerical advantage of around 150,000 men, Graziani's command failed spectacularly against a smaller and lighter British attack. Lev Mekhlis was a Soviet commander who turned out to be much better at executing purges than he was at fighting wars. In early 1942, Mekhlis was sent to defend Crimea against German invasion. As a commissar, he was a hostile presence toward his own comrades, bullying commanders and shuffling around personnel on his own whims. During the Battle of the Kerch Peninsula, Mekhlis's meddling became something of an advantage for the Germans. Hoping for some great majestic offensive to take place, he issued strange orders like banning the digging of trenches and moving artillery to the front lines. As a result, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's men carved through the Red Army. Mekhlis, ever the politician, was quick to try to protect his image and deflect blame to other commanders by writing to Stalin himself. Instead of obtaining the support of his old friend, Mekhlis received a sharp and scathing reminder of his responsibilities to the Soviet Union. In the end, the 5-month Kerch campaign was a disaster for the Russians. In May alone, they lost an estimated 170,000 troops. After Crimea, Mekhlis was swiftly demoted and relieved of his position. The Battle of Hurtgen Forest was a brutal and bloody confrontation between American and German forces, and things looked bleak for the Americans.
And I said, God, am I going to die here in a lousy German field?
Having a lousy commander didn't help. The fighting, which began in September 1944 and lasted nearly 5 months, was so fierce that American soldiers dubbed the area the Death Factory. Tragically, the nickname was more than fitting. The U.S. suffered nearly 34,000 casualties over the course of the battle. To make matters worse, historians have since claimed that the bloody affair should never have happened in the first place, as the forest itself offered little to no strategic value to the Allies. In the fall of 1944, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges shared in widespread Allied optimism before the battle. He reportedly said, "Given 10 good days of weather, the war might well be over as far as organized resistance was concerned." As commander of the U.S. First Army, Hodges fumbled his responsibilities by delegating many of his duties to his chief of staff. He also had a reputation as a harsh and absent leader, often dismissing his subordinates and rarely visiting troops on the front lines. During the Battle of Hurtgen Forest, Hodges sent scores of men into an unforgiving terrain, knowing they'd receive little air or armored support. The force swallowed up valuable American manpower and bogged troops down for almost half a year.
It was a nightmare. I don't think there can be a worse hell.
Military historian and Hurtgen veteran Charles B. McDonald summarized the chaotic situation simply: a misconceived and basically fruitless battle that should have been avoided. Kliment Voroshilov was a military commander whose leadership did little to help the Soviet cause during the Second World War. Despite a terrible outing during the Finnish-Soviet War, Stalin gave his old friend one more chance in July 1941 when he assigned Voroshilov to helm the defense of Leningrad. While multiple accounts recognize Voroshilov for displaying immense valor during the fighting around Leningrad, his strategic approach left much to be desired. Frankly, it's actually difficult to pin down what his tactics actually were in the first place. Roy Medvedev, author of All Stalin's Men, highlights Voroshilov's apparent refusal to stop German forces from encircling the city. He writes, "Voroshilov acted bravely but incompetently. He had plenty of nerve and often drove out to the front line of the defense squarely in the enemy's view. What he lacked was firmness in his command of the troops. At the end of August, Leningrad was virtually surrounded. At one point, Voroshilov failed to notify Stalin of the capture of a nearby town. The Soviet leader discovered this news by reading a German report. Medvedev's account cites a blundering marine offensive led by Voroshilov the day he was supposed to be relieved, a desperate act for a desperate cog in the imperious Soviet system. But the planning of Voroshilov's counterattack earned him nothing but ridicule from his peers. He found himself swiftly replaced by the far more capable Georgy Zhukov, who made a point of ignoring every piece of advice Voroshilov tried to offer. The Battle of Peleliu was one of the most tragic military engagements in World War II, mostly because it was totally unnecessary. While we can certainly point the finger at the top brass for this, the tactical failures of Peleliu were very much the fault of General William H. Rupertus. Rupertus expressed immense overconfidence before the offensive began, believing Japanese forces on the island would be defeated in a matter of days. In the end, the campaign lasted over 2 months. Rupertus, a proud Marine through and through, balked at the idea of army troops coming in to assist his forces, and he did little to quell the bitter rivalry between the two branches. According to Bill D. Ross, author of Peleliu Tragic Triumph, Rupertus didn't show enough interest in the training issues his men encountered during the preparation phases of the operation. Despite those problems, Rupertus's optimism seemed unwavering. J. A. Isley, a military historian and Princeton University professor, later summarized the constant mishaps that plagued the operation from the beginning. He said, "Thoughtful observers might well regard these unhappy incidents as harbingers of calamities yet to come." In the end, the American forces won the Battle of Peleliu, but not without cost. Over 1,300 Marines were killed and 5,400 wounded.
It seemed like it would never stop, although it was a small island. It seemed like it was forever.
John P. Lucas was an American general tasked with establishing an Allied beachhead near Rome. Filled with immense reservations from the very start, Lucas was surprised to find little to no resistance when his men landed at Anzio on January 22, 1944. As it turned out, the operation had caught the German army with their backs turned. According to Stephen R. Tave, by the end of the day, Lucas had 36,000 troops ashore. There were, in fact, almost no Germans between Anzio and Rome, presenting Lucas with the opportunity to seize the Italian capital. Instead, Lucas followed his instincts and his interpretation of his ambiguous orders by instructing his men to dig in along a defensive perimeter. This cautious attitude proved to be costly. Had Lucas taken the initiative, he and his men could have marched forward and caught the Germans totally unawares. Because he spent so long in organizing his defense, the enemy was given time to regroup and prepare. This turned the Battle of Anzio into a bitter firefight, one that lasted until June and caused thousands of Allied casualties. Both the Anzio stalemate and Lucas's leadership have received plenty of criticism in the years since, with the most famous jibe coming from Winston Churchill, who once said, "I had hoped we were hurling a wildcat into the shore, but all we got was a stranded whale." Historians have often cited Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's command style as cautious. However, Montgomery threw caution out the window for Operation Market Garden. In the fall of 1944, after the colossal success of the D-Day landings in June, the German army was on the back foot. To capitalize on this momentum, Montgomery concocted a plan to try and win the war in one blow. The chief objective of Operation Market Garden, which commenced in mid-September, was for Allied forces to take key bridges in the Netherlands that would allow them direct access across the River Rhine into northern German territory. Unfortunately, the operation failed in its main objective after losing the Battle of Arnhem. Overall, Montgomery's plan was too optimistic. The level of potential German resistance was not given the proper respect, and the element of surprise was squandered, as Allied troops were forced to make multiple landings over consecutive days due to the limited availability of aircraft transport. Additionally, to reinforce British fighting at Arnhem, the Allied troops had to rely on moving up one narrow road, which quickly became blocked by traffic. As famed military historian Sir Anthony Beevor declared,
"Operation Market Garden should never have been launched."
Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and his Africa Corps frequently lauded to a near mythical degree for their military prowess, particularly in North Africa. While Rommel's victories, which earned him the moniker of the Desert Fox, certainly stunned and shocked his Allied foes, historians like Larry H. Addington concluded after the war that even Rommel's greatest achievements in North Africa didn't amount to much in the grand scheme of Axis strategy. Even at the height of Rommel's success in North Africa, he and his forces were never in the most optimal position, often reliant on captured British supplies and vehicles, and frequent ill-advised clashes with his superiors only made things more precarious.
Animosity between Rommel and some of Hitler's military advisors was at the root of the problem.
In his book Field Marshal: The Life and Death of Erwin Rommel, Daniel Allen Butler writes that during his early career fighting in Belgium and France, Rommel was also too prone to leave his staff and sometimes even his radio vehicle behind, while personally directing the actions of a single company or battalion, making effective coordination of the division's armor, infantry, and artillery problematic at best. A commander of Rommel's caliber should have recognized that communication issues can spell doom for any operation. Even Butler, who frequently defends the German commander against accusations targeting his alleged logistical shortcomings, admits that Rommel could needlessly impede his own momentum by keeping his staff in the dark. Sebastiano Visconti Prasca is not one of the most well-known World War II generals. However, he should be, if not for any stunning military victory, at least for his incredible incompetence. In hindsight, Prasca, a commander who was more into working out at the gym than leading his men, was a huge gift to the Allies, as his ineptness helped crumble the Italian invasion of Greece. The Italian general believed the campaign in Greece would be an easy one, shrugging off any chances the Greeks had with comments like, "They're not people who like fighting." Well, as history proved, Prasca was wrong. The invasion of Greece was a complete disaster that required German intervention in order to save Axis momentum. Italian forces suffered around 150,000 casualties, while Greece suffered closer to 90,000. Prasca was relieved of his command only 2 weeks into the invasion. Japanese Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi deserves much more attention from military historians and World War II buffs for how incredibly reckless his tactics were. After securing victory against the British in Singapore in 1942, Mutaguchi wished to continue his success, this time in India. He believed that if the British could be overcome in northeastern India, the rest of the subcontinent would soon follow, and even looked at his forces as sort of liberation force from British rule. While Mutaguchi certainly knew how to dream big, he was terrible at planning small. When on the offensive against British opposition in Impal, he had thousands of his men march great distances while only carrying 20 days' worth of provisions. Mutaguchi believed that if they trekked light, lived off the land, and stole British supplies, speed would be their ultimate ally against the enemy. The Japanese commander also assumed British opposition would crumble at the first sight of pressure and ignored their formidable air force. It was a military disaster. According to Burma, the longest war, Japanese casualties totaled 54,879, while the British only lost 12,603. In December 1944, Mutaguchi was called back to Tokyo, relieved of his command, and forced into retirement. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in 1943 is widely remembered for two things. It was the first clash between American and German forces, and it was the battle where Major General Lloyd Fredendall etched his name into the history books for all the wrong reasons. Fredendall, a West Point graduate and veteran of the First World War, commanded the American troops, while General Kenneth Anderson commanded his British allies. Despite outnumbering the Germans under Rommel, the Allies reportedly suffered more than 10 times as many casualties. Both Anderson and Fredendall were heavily criticized, but it was Fredendall who took the fall. Although Allied Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower couldn't directly place the blame on Fredendall due to the latter's connections, he still relieved Fredendall of command. Fredendall was sent back to the United States, where he remained for the duration of the war. Soviet Marshal Grigory Kulik's gross arrogance and incompetence were given a historic spotlight when he attempted to lead the initial stages of the Leningrad Front in 1941. Historians agree that his inept command gave way to dire setbacks and serious defeats, and he was swiftly relieved of his command. Kulik appears to have been more interested in currying favor with Soviet leader Joseph Stalin than focusing on pragmatic military command and technological innovation. Post-war historians have frequently noted that Kulik spent an absurd amount of energy and time opposing certain mechanized advancements. John Keegan, author of The Second World War, wrote of the Soviet commander, "Kulik was a technological reactionary who opposed the distribution of automatic weapons to soldiers on the grounds that they were incapable of handling them, and halted the production of anti-tank and anti-craft guns." In a period when the Soviet Union would need every advantage they could muster against Nazi Germany, Kulik's actions were detrimental to the Soviet cause. By multiple accounts, he consistently acted as an obstacle against certain technological advancements regarding tanks throughout his military tenure. Major General Rodney Keller, who led the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, may not be one of the most prominent Allied commanders from World War II, but he did take part in D-Day. Sadly, whatever contributions he made were overshadowed by a propensity for drinking and a lack of respect for standard security protocol regarding intel. While Keller's colorful language and gregarious nature made him popular among everyday soldiers, it drove his senior officers up the wall. Keller led his forces, around 14,500 Canadian soldiers, during the Normandy landings and fought on Juno Beach. But by all accounts, throughout Keller's tenure in France, he failed to impress. He was reportedly always jumpy and appeared only to be interested in his own safety. This led to claims that Keller was yeller. Keller himself recognized that he was in over his head and tried to resign. His resignation was refused. Shortly after D-Day, on August 8th, Keller was wounded by friendly fire and replaced. He received no further commands for the duration of the war. The Battle of Okinawa is frequently cited as World War II's bloodiest Pacific engagement. The Allied victory over the small island cost over 75,000 American casualties, while some estimates put Japanese losses at more than 250,000. American forces attacked Okinawa on April 1, 1945. Japanese Lieutenant General Isamu Cho organized the island's defense alongside Colonel Yahara Hiromichi, with the latter preferring a defense-oriented strategy. Believing the American offensive was vulnerable, though, Cho launched a massive attack on May 4th against the American troops against Yahara's warnings. It was a complete failure. By the next day, Cho and his forces were retreating, and the writing was on the wall. On June 19th, knowing the American victory was a certainty, the lieutenant general died by ritual suicide. What makes Cho's actions so peculiar is that he and Yahara had worked together to set up fortifications and tunnels that could be relied on in a sort of attrition-type strategy. However, just a little over a month after the battle began, Cho completely shifted gears by sending the majority of his forces in a disastrous charge instead of utilizing those defenses. General Douglas MacArthur is arguably the most famous U.S. World War II general next to Dwight Eisenhower. However, unlike the level-headed Eisenhower, MacArthur was a renowned blowhard. The general would boast loudly and proudly about his achievements, but wouldn't acknowledge his many mistakes which thousands of his men paid for with their lives. In 1941, MacArthur was given command of the U.S. Army in the Far East. On December 8th, several hours after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they went after another airfield in the Philippines. Despite having received word of what transpired at Pearl Harbor, MacArthur severely delayed mobilizing his aircraft. When the Japanese attacked, the American bombers were still grounded.
I think if it were anyone else but MacArthur that this disaster happened to, they might have been promptly relieved.
The Philippines would eventually be overrun early in the war, with President Franklin Roosevelt ordering MacArthur to leave for Australia. The general left thousands of American and Filipino troops behind. These troops would be forced to endure what is now notoriously known as the Bataan Death March. MacArthur's follies continued throughout the war. In 1944, to support his campaign to take the Philippines back, the Marines were sent to engage the Japanese at Peleliu. The prolonged and bloody engagement lasted months and saw over 1,000 Americans killed and several thousand wounded. To this day, the battle remains shrouded in tragic controversy, as Peleliu ultimately didn't really factor into MacArthur's plans to retake the Philippines. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched a campaign against France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Belgium. General Maurice Gamelin, France's commander-in-chief, was in charge of stopping it. He didn't. Gamelin's planning for the initial stages of the Western Front were grossly inadequate. Gamelin put too much emphasis on defense and lacked contingencies should his first plans fail. He and his allied contemporaries prepared for a prolonged and cagey engagement reminiscent of World War I's stationary nature. The French commander predicted that Belgium would be the enemy's initial focus and placed his best troops there, but left the Ardennes forest undefended. The Germans ultimately unleashed a motorized offensive through the forest, outflanking Gamelin's prized defensive line in an attack that moved too fast for Gamelin's countermeasures. Much of the French army was cut off and had to be evacuated to Britain, leaving Paris vulnerable. On May 19th, just 9 days after the battle began, Gamelin was sacked. To replace Gamelin, the French government brought in veteran commander Maxime Weygand. Unfortunately, this turned out to be oil on a raging inferno.
Weygand's ideas were just as outdated as Gamelin's, and so his succession to the command saw no significant change in Allied tactics.
On the morning of May 19th, the French command ordered troops fighting in Belgium to redeploy to meet the attacking Germans. That evening, Weygand was given command, and one of the first things he did was to cancel that counterattack. But after conferring with other Allied commanders for 3 days, Weygand committed to the same exact plan that was made before. Those 3 wasted days gave the German infantry an opportunity to catch up with its rapidly moving heavy armor. The opportunity to stop the German advance had been wasted. Paris fell on June 14, 1940, and an official armistice was signed with Germany on June 22nd. Just 11 months earlier, in July 1939, Weygand had declared, "The French army is stronger than ever before in its history. Its equipment is the best, its fortifications are first rate, its morale excellent, and it has an outstanding high command. Nobody wants war, but if we are forced to win a new victory, then we will win it."